Argentina should be rich, but today it's decidedly average. Why? Even more confusing is the fact that over 100 years ago, Argentina was among the wealthiest countries in the world. The French had a phrase to describe the excessive wealth of the Argentinian people as rich like an Argentine. They bought art and drove art prices up all over Europe. Wealthy landowners were building personal homes in Argentina that resembled palaces. And behind it all was a massive agrarian export economy. But today, things are completely different, and not in a good way. After 9 sovereign debts, Argentina finds itself with 160% inflation, 40% poverty rate, and all of those metrics are likely worse by the time you watch this video. This is a disaster. There is often a sense of unrealized potential, a sense of tragedy when you hear accounts of the economic situation in Argentina. And while everyone is unhappy with the economic situation, perhaps no group more so than the youth of Argentina, who overwhelmingly voted in a new leader, a radical leader that has wildly different ideas about how Argentina should move into the future. President Javier Milei is an outsider, a performer, and an economist. How did Argentina fall from being on the path to becoming a superpower? What can be done to change this, and is the new political leader the answer? Argentina was once an economic powerhouse. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s was when Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It was driven by immense natural resources, pro-immigration policies that quadrupled the size of the country, and exports like grain and cattle that were the driving factors behind economic growth. This was a time of prosperity and optimism about the future. However, almost every aspect about Argentina seems to be controversial. Even the fact that Argentina was once wealthy is now a little bit of a controversial thought. There is a more nuanced view here, and that is that while Argentina was wealthy, it was also underdeveloped. It was wealthy, but it failed to industrialize. Because the wealth was generated from an agrarian export perspective, it failed to modernize and industrialize, which means that it just got left behind. There are a few notable differences from Argentina to the other wealthy countries at that time. Namely, that Argentina did not have the invention capabilities, it did not have the literacy or education of some of these other wealthy countries, and finally, it had an immense centralized wealth. All of these factors were obstacles that prevented Argentina from modernizing at that time period. The paper Yet Another Tale of Two Cities does an excellent job of comparing Buenos Aires to Chicago, two world-class cities at that time and two agrarian-driven economies. When you look at the literacy rate between the two, the gap is substantial. Literacy rate is an imperfect metric to measure the relative education levels of the two cities, and we see that Argentina falls substantially behind. This dovetails with innovation and invention, and Chicago was a magnet for this. One example of this was the McCormick Reaper. This was a mechanical device pulled by a horse that was used to cut wheat. Using the traditional handheld scythe, a farmer could cut 1 acre of wheat in roughly 14 hours. When that same farmer used the McCormick Reaper, it cut the time down to 90 minutes. The McCormick Reaper was built in Chicago and exported all over the world, including Argentina. Finally, Argentina's wealth was incredibly centralized with the landowning elite that additionally had a significant amount of political power. Argentina was rich, but it was unable to industrialize. It was unable to modernize or keep pace with the modern world. These factors that I've outlined don't take away from the wealth that Argentina was able to accumulate, but they do show that Argentina was at a disadvantage when it was trying to industrialize. After the high point of the early 20th century, Argentina's economy started falling and has fallen to where it is today. The economist Simon Kuznets said that there are 4 types of countries in the world: developed, developing, Japan, and Argentina. I want to touch on peronism, which has largely been the dominant ideology of Argentina and has a complicated legacy. It can be difficult to wrap your head around exactly what peronism is because it differs from traditional ideologies. Take capitalism, communism, socialism, all of the isms. They are a set of ideas that come together to form a single cohesive ideology. But peronism is different. It can be linked directly to the policies of Juan Perón and can almost be thought of as a cult of personality. It is a form of populism that generally focuses on the lower and middle classes. Many leading political figures that span all the way from the left to the center right claim to be Peronist. It's really all over the place. The most generous interpretation is that the results of Peronism are kind of a mixed bag. They did oversee the majority of Argentina's decline. To this day, the nation remains deeply divided over Juan Perón and Peronism. The current situation is that Argentina is living in excess of 160% inflation, and that number might be out of date by the time you see this. For comparison, both the US and Europe have recently gone through a period of significant inflation. The US was at 9.5%, while Europe was at 10.5%. Poverty rate is at 40%, with youth poverty rate at 60%, and Argentina holds more debt to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, than any other nation in the world. This creates an environment for a charismatic outside leader to rise to power. Javier Milei was an economist that has recently been elected as president. His political party, Freedom Advances, has existed for roughly 2 years. He describes his political views as libertarian, but others have described him anywhere from right to far right to classical liberal. And the US media tends to make comparisons to our own politicians, most commonly Trump. But I don't like comparing US politicians to international politicians. I think that we can learn a lot from the situation, but the United States is the United States, Milei is Milei, and Argentina is certainly its own thing. Milei has a wide range of social views and an even wilder personal life. He has cloned his dog 5 times. I didn't realize that you could do that or that it was even legal. And despite all this, I find his economic views to be the most interesting, because he wants to dollarize the economy. What is dollarization, you ask? Well, thankfully, this is one of those economic concepts that's actually easy to explain. It means that instead of the Argentine peso, you use dollars everywhere. So when you go to the store to pay for groceries, dollars. When a business makes an investment, it's in dollars. When a bank or a government transaction occurs, it's all in US dollars. And this has the benefit of stability, price stability. Dollarization has been done before, but not by Argentina. El Salvador, Panama, and Ecuador have all dollarized. I was in Ecuador a few months ago, and it's quite the experience as an American. You don't have to exchange your dollars because that's what they use. Do you remember the $1 Sacagawea coin from the mid-2000s? I would pay for a coffee and I would break like a $20 bill and I would get back 17 or 18 $1 Sacagawea coins. I think they all ended up down in Ecuador. They weren't very popular in the US. And what does dollarization do? Well, it brings about price stability. But while it definitely stabilizes an economy, it doesn't necessarily promote growth. And you should be aware that this approach is contentious. In an open letter, 100 leading economists oppose Milei's plan, mostly on the grounds that dollarization could or would lead to prolonged poor economic conditions. Ecuador's former president, Jamil Mawad, was largely responsible for dollarizing Ecuador's economy 20 years ago, back in 2000. He outlines 3 critical conditions that need to be met in order for a country to dollarize.
If you have the right economic decision and the people are ready to use that, you need political viability.
Regarding technical ability, my position is that Argentina can do this. The economist Scott Smith argues that this may be one of the best times for Argentina to dollarize because the population so heavily uses dollars already. Another technical benefit that is often overlooked is that this doesn't have to happen all at once. In the case of Ecuador, it took more than a year for this to happen. Social acceptance is a bit trickier. President Milei did win with 56% of the vote. This is a wide margin for victory, but it also leaves a substantial portion that is against him, and in his case, passionately so. Only a few days into office, he provoked widespread protests when he announced hundreds of economic decrees. These are economic decrees that are intended to free up the market and reduce government involvement in the economy. So does he or doesn't he have the will of the people? Well, for comparison, let's look at Ecuador. When the former president announced that the economy would dollarize January 9th, 2000, he was removed from office within 12 days from a people's uprising/military junta. So when the former president says you need the will of the people, it's on a relative scale. And finally, we come to political viability, and Milei doesn't have it. Specifically with Congress, he controls 15% of the lower house and less than 10% of the Senate. Sure, maybe he can make some deals, but that's a really big chasm to cross. And Milei knows this. He's toned down the rhetoric on dollarization as he's transitioned from the campaign trail into his presidential office. Additionally, a dollarization advocate rejected Milei's offer to appoint him as governor of the central bank. This is important because you need a dollarization advocate to help facilitate the transition, and instead, a much more moderate figure took the office. This leaves us with a lot of uncertainty. Political strategist Peter Zeihan has argued that President Milei is a lot of fuss about nothing.
When it comes to Argentina, there can be a lot of smoke without being fire and a lot of noise without anything real happening.
But more than just the immediate situation, I think the president has helped to elevate Argentina globally. A more nuanced understanding of the economy, of the history of the political situation. And let's remember that this has been complicated for more than a century. I often look far ahead to see if things will improve. I think that too much passion in the moment can cloud the issue. But it is that passion and vibrancy in Argentina, and especially its youth, that leaves me inspired and optimistic about the future. I think it just might take a while to get there.